Tehran, late November 1979. The streets outside the U.S. Embassy boiled with rage. Students carried placards denouncing America, chanting against the Shah, waving rifles and fists in the air. Behind the embassy gates, chaos had already erupted. Militants had stormed the compound, dragging American diplomats and Marines at gunpoint, binding their hands, forcing them onto the ground as the Iranian Revolution's fury crashed against the last symbols of Western presence. These records are drawn from declassified files and public archives. Leave a comment. Where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it where you are? Like and subscribe for more declassified stories. Not all of them were captured. In the first frantic hours, as the embassy fell, 6 Americans slipped out. They moved fast, unnoticed in the noise and confusion, disappearing into the alleys of the city. For days they hid in borrowed apartments, shuffling from safe spot to safe spot, hunted by the Revolutionary Guard. To be caught was unthinkable. They would not be paraded as hostages. They would likely be tried as spies. And Tehran in that moment was a city where mobs hung effigies from lampposts. By the end of the month, the 6 found themselves sheltered inside the homes of Canadian diplomats. It was a fragile sanctuary. The Canadians risked their own safety to hide them, but time was running out. The Iranian security services were sweeping neighborhoods, interviewing landlords, rooting through records. Every day the risk of discovery grew sharper. In Washington, the CIA faced a dilemma. How do you pull 6 Americans out of a hostile capital crawling with militia when the airport itself was a gauntlet of Revolutionary Guard checkpoints, conventional exfiltration plans, false passports, smuggled cars, covert flights? All seemed inadequate under the scrutiny of Iran's revolutionary committees. To attempt the ordinary was to invite capture. The plan needed to be extraordinary. Enter Tony Mendez, a CIA officer specializing in disguises and clandestine exfiltrations. Mendez was not a soldier or a politician. He was an artist who had spent years turning that skill into intelligence tradecraft. He had once built masks that made men into unrecognizable doubles, forged documents that withstood forensic inspection, created cover stories so complete they could survive interrogation. His job now was to imagine the impossible, to build a story so convincing that 6 hunted Americans could walk through Tehran International Airport in broad daylight and board a commercial flight to freedom. The answer, when it came, was audacious. A fake movie, a fake production company, a fake Canadian film crew scouting locations in Iran. The cover story would be absurd enough to seem real, detailed enough to pass inspection, and daring enough to exploit a weakness in the system. Even a revolutionary government was eager for the appearance of normal business, cultural exchange, and legitimacy. If 6 Americans could pose as Canadian filmmakers, they might just escape. A fake movie, forged passports, and a CIA artist who bet everything on a lie. Drawn from declassified files and public archives, this is the true story of how 6 Americans walked out of Tehran in the middle of a revolution. To understand why 6 Americans were trapped in Tehran in 1979, you have to step back into the collapse of a monarchy and the fever of revolution. For decades, Iran had been ruled by Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, the Shah of Iran, whose modernization policies were matched by ruthless repression. Backed by US arms and wealth, the Shah had positioned himself as a Western ally in the Middle East. But beneath the surface, resentment simmered. His secret police, Savak, built with CIA training in the 1950s, had become synonymous with torture and fear. By the mid-1970s, the Shah's government was faltering under corruption, inequality, and opposition movements that ranged from Islamic clerics to leftist guerrillas. The spark came in 1978-79 when mass protests swelled into millions on Tehran's streets. The Shah fled in January 1979, seeking exile. Into the vacuum stepped Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, returning from exile in Paris to a hero's welcome. The monarchy collapsed, and an Islamic republic was declared. But revolutions are rarely orderly. Tehran became a city of competing factions. Clerics, radicals, Marxists, militias, all vying for control. Anti-American sentiment was at a fever pitch. The US had been the Shah's great patron, and in the eyes of revolutionaries, that made America guilty of every abuse. The US Embassy was a tempting symbol. On November 4th, 1979, hundreds of student militants stormed the gates, seizing control of the compound in hours. 52 Americans were taken hostage, beginning a crisis that would last 444 days. In the confusion, 6 diplomats escaped. They slipped outside doors and into Tehran's back streets, blending into the chaos of the capital. For days they drifted, uncertain who might shelter them. To ask for help was to risk betrayal. Any Iranian who harbored Americans could face arrest, or worse. Eventually they found refuge with Canadian diplomats, most notably Ambassador Ken Taylor and Consul John Sherdown. These men and their families, at enormous personal risk, hid the 6 in their homes, feeding them, covering their movements, maintaining the appearance of normal life while Revolutionary Guards scoured neighborhoods for fugitives. For the Americans, the anxiety was suffocating. They could not leave the houses, could not phone relatives, could not risk even a glimpse through a window. Every knock at the door might be the guard. They read, they whispered, they tried to remain calm. But as days turned to weeks, their chances of discovery grew. Rumors circulated that some Iranians suspected foreigners were hiding nearby. In Washington, the intelligence community recognized the problem. The 52 hostages in the embassy were already a national crisis, but the 6 in hiding represented a different challenge. They were not symbols for negotiation. They were loose ends that could be exploited by the revolutionary regime if captured. Worse, if the 6 were found and paraded on Iranian television, it would deepen the humiliation of the United States. The mandate was clear. The CIA would get them out, quietly, without leaving a footprint that could jeopardize the Canadian diplomats who had risked everything. Conventional escape options were immediately ruled out. The borders were sealed. Smuggling across land routes was nearly impossible. Under the revolutionary militias, the only path was through Mehrabad International Airport, the heavily guarded gateway to Tehran. But the airport was a fortress in its own right. Revolutionary guards monitored every passenger, scrutinizing documents, questioning foreigners. The airport police had orders to detain anyone suspicious. To walk 6 American diplomats through that gauntlet required a cover story so airtight, so brazen, that it would withstand not only inspection, but suspicion. The CIA knew this was not a mission for brute force. It was a mission for deception, creativity, and flawless execution. That mandate landed on the desk of Tony Mendez, known inside Langley as a master of disguise and document forgery. Mendez was a quiet operator. He had smuggled agents out of hostile countries before, using wigs, prosthetics, and false identities. But Tehran in 1979 was different. The entire city was on edge. Foreigners were watched obsessively. and the Revolutionary Guard thrived on paranoia. To succeed here required more than a disguise. It required a full identity, a convincing world built out of thin air. So Mendez and a small circle of CIA colleagues began sketching ideas. Could they pose the six as agricultural consultants, as teachers, as oil workers? Each idea fell apart under scrutiny. They needed something bold enough to be disarming, yet detailed enough to feel authentic. Something that would let six nervous Americans walk with their heads high through an airport crawling with suspicion. The plan that emerged would sound absurd, even laughable to an outsider, but to Mendez, it was perfect. A fake Hollywood movie, a fake production company, a fake Canadian film crew scouting exotic locations in Iran for a science fiction epic with forged passports, production artwork, and the swagger of show business. The six could pass as filmmakers. The guards would not suspect diplomats in hiding. They would see eccentric Canadians, charmed by their own confidence. It was risky, outrageous, and it just might work. Tony Mendez approached the Tehran problem like an artist facing a blank canvas. The stakes were life or death, but the tools were familiar. Documents, disguises, stories that blurred truth and fabrication until the two were indistinguishable. At CIA headquarters, the task was not just to create false papers, but to create a full alternate reality in which six Americans could live for a few hours, long enough to walk out of Tehran and board a flight to freedom. Mendez's specialty was tradecraft rooted in illusion. He had once described disguise work as a blend of magic and engineering, the ability to trick both the human eye and bureaucratic systems at the same time. The Iranians would not just glance at the six Americans' passports. They would interrogate them, measure their confidence, look for any cracks in their story. A single hesitation could unravel the mission. That meant every detail of the cover had to be watertight. The CIA's first attempts at plausible cover identities, agricultural consultants, development aid staff, teachers, collapsed under scrutiny. These roles required paperwork, knowledge of local systems, and the ability to blend with Iran's political climate. None of them could explain why six foreigners would suddenly leave the country in the middle of a revolution. Then came the audacious idea: film crews. Hollywood productions were known for eccentricity, mobility, and bravado. A group of Canadians scouting locations for a science fiction movie would be unusual, yes, but unusual in a way that made sense. The film industry thrived on spectacle. Foreign filmmakers had traveled to stranger places than Tehran. If they carried production documents, storyboards, and an official Canadian business front, their presence could seem believable. Mendez reached out to trusted contacts in Hollywood. The CIA had long maintained quiet relationships with certain figures in the entertainment industry, recognizing film's potential both as propaganda and as cover. With their help, he built a front company called Studio 6 Productions, named after the six diplomats it would be used to protect. The details were meticulous. They leased office space in Los Angeles. They printed business cards and letterhead. They created a full script, a science fiction film called Argo, a story about intergalactic adventure that conveniently required exotic desert landscapes. They produced concept art borrowed from real Hollywood designers, showing futuristic costumes and otherworldly settings. They even placed advertisements in Variety magazine, announcing that Studio 6 was preparing a feature film. In Tehran, the Americans would not just be holding forged passports, they would be filmmakers, able to point to a script, a production company, and press clippings that proved their cover story. It was a web of lies, woven so densely that it became hard to distinguish from truth. Mendez also prepared the documents themselves. Canadian passports were forged with the highest precision, bearing authentic seals and codes. Production schedules were typed. Visa applications were filled with plausible travel histories. Each of the 6 Americans was assigned a role: director, cinematographer, screenwriter, producer. They rehearsed their stories, memorized their aliases, and practiced answering questions with confidence. Surveillance was also part of the equation. Tehran was a city crawling with informants. Revolutionary guards monitored foreigners, hotels, and travel agencies. The CIA studied how passengers were questioned at the airport, which desks inspected passports, which guards asked random questions, how tickets were verified. They identified pressure points where suspicion might flare and built answers in advance. Tradecraft in this mission was as much psychological as technical. Mendez knew that fear could betray the 6 far faster than paperwork could save them. He trained them to carry themselves as professionals, not nervous escapees, but arrogant filmmakers annoyed at bureaucratic delays. He reminded them that revolutionary guards might be brutal, but they were also inexperienced in international film culture. Confidence, not concealment, would be their shield. In late January 1980, Mendez himself flew to Tehran, carrying the final set of forged documents and cover materials. He would escort the 6 personally. His arrival was quiet, unnoticed, the entry of an artist about to stage his most dangerous performance. Inside the Canadian ambassador's residence, the 6 Americans gathered around him as he laid out the plan. He explained their roles, their names, their production company. He handed them forged passports and tickets on Swissair and Austrian Airlines. He showed them the film posters and storyboards. He rehearsed them until they could answer without thinking. Each of them felt the weight of the deception, not just forged paper, but a fabricated identity they would have to inhabit convincingly under the eyes of armed guards. It was more than an escape. It was theater, a show performed for the Revolutionary Guards, with freedom as the prize. The 6 Americans had been hiding for weeks in borrowed rooms, surviving on Canadian hospitality and nerves stretched to breaking point. Their hosts, Ambassador Ken Taylor and Consul John Showdown, were risking not only their careers but their lives. If the Revolutionary Guard discovered that Canadian diplomats were sheltering fugitives, the retaliation could be severe: expulsion at best, imprisonment, or worse at worst. Yet the Canadians never wavered. They agreed to stand with the Americans until an escape was possible. By late January 1980, the Argo plan was ready to move. Tony Mendez had arrived in Tehran with the final cover materials, forged Canadian passports, airline tickets, production company dossiers, and a briefcase filled with the trappings of Hollywood. The 6 diplomats gathered inside Taylor's residence as Mendez distributed their new identities. Each one was carefully assigned. One would be the producer, the confident deal-maker. Another the director, aloof and artistic. Others became cinematographer, screenwriter, production designer, and associate producer. They rehearsed their stories as if for an audition, learning not only the facts, but the mannerisms of people who belonged in the film industry. They practiced explaining Argo, a science fiction epic in the mold of Star Wars, set in exotic deserts and ancient cities. They studied the production artwork, memorized the names of Canadian crew members supposedly waiting for them back home, and learned to answer questions with weary arrogance, as though bored by bureaucracy. The Canadian government did its part. Ottawa issued genuine cover passports for the 6 Americans, a gesture of quiet defiance in the face of Iranian suspicion. To provide diplomatic legitimacy, Ambassador Taylor prepared letters of introduction and travel permissions, authenticating the group as a bona fide Canadian film crew. With CIA forgeries and Canadian backing, the documents were as strong as any cover story could be. But the risks were immense. The Revolutionary Guard had already begun searching for the missing Americans. Leaflets circulated with descriptions. Safe houses were raided. At one point, Canadian staff overheard neighbors speculating that foreigners might be hiding nearby. Even a careless glance out a window could have exposed them. Each day that passed increased the chance of betrayal. Mendez drilled the group again and again. He reminded them that the airport would be the most dangerous point. Rows of Revolutionary Guards inspecting passports, questioning travelers, searching bags. Their safety depended on performance. If even one of them faltered, if one broke into nervous English or hesitated when asked about the film, the entire group would be detained, and once detained, their cover would unravel in minutes. To bolster confidence, Mendez had created tangible proof of their story. He carried film posters with the Argo logo, storyboards of alien landscapes, and production notes in Farsi that hinted at plans to shoot in Iran. The idea was simple: overwhelm suspicion with detail. Guards who questioned them would be handed documents so thorough that the risk of contradiction seemed pointless. While the CIA prepared, the Canadians quietly dismantled their involvement. Taylor burned embassy files that could implicate Canada. Staff members rehearsed their own lines in case Iranian authorities questioned them. To cover their tracks after the escape, Canada planned to close its embassy in Tehran, withdrawing its personnel before the regime could retaliate. The mission was no longer just an exfiltration. It was a high-stakes diplomatic gamble. The choreography was exact. On the morning of January 28, 1980, Mendez and the 6 Americans would leave the Canadian residences separately, converging at the airport. They would move through ticketing, customs, and security as one unit, presenting themselves as Studio 6 Productions, scouting Tehran for film locations. Mendez, posing as their production manager, would lead. If they were questioned, he would answer with calm confidence, producing the film dossier. The others were to remain in character, never contradicting their roles. In Washington, the mission was watched with tense anticipation. President Jimmy Carter had approved the exfiltration, though few details were shared beyond a tight circle. The operation's success depended on secrecy. If news leaked, the Revolutionary Guard could sweep the airport instantly. At CIA headquarters, officers waited for confirmation of departure, knowing that any delay could mean disaster. Inside the Canadian embassy, the final night was heavy with silence. The 6 packed their few belongings, leaving behind clothes, books, and personal effects they could not carry. They rehearsed once more, repeating their cover stories aloud like actors before a premiere. Mendez checked their documents a final time, smoothing creases, verifying stamps, making sure every line matched. If the plan worked, they would be in Zurich by evening. If it failed, they would be prisoners of the Revolutionary Guard within minutes. There was no middle ground. At dawn, Tehran was gray with winter fog as they climbed into cars for the drive to Mehrabad International Airport. Ahead lay the gauntlet of checkpoints, guards, and suspicion. Behind them, the walls of the Canadian residence closed like a stage curtain. The performance was about to begin. The Argo exfiltration was not only a feat of tradecraft, it was a delicate act of diplomacy. In Tehran, the 6 Americans were hiding in Canadian safe houses. In Ottawa, the government of Prime Minister Joe Clark was weighing how far it could go in defying the Islamic Republic, and in Washington, President Jimmy Carter's administration was desperate for a win in the face of a hostage crisis that seemed to paralyze American power. Canada's role was critical. Without authentic Canadian documents, the plan would have collapsed before it began. Forged passports, no matter how skillful, would not survive the scrutiny of Iranian border officials if even the smallest detail appeared false. The Canadian government issued genuine travel documents under false identities, knowing full well that discovery could trigger diplomatic disaster. If Iranian officials uncovered the ruse, Canada's entire mission in Tehran would be expelled, its diplomats branded accomplices of the CIA. The cost was not abstract. Ambassador Ken Taylor and his staff lived under constant fear. They knew their homes were under watch. They knew the Revolutionary Guard was combing the city for missing Americans. If the six were discovered, the Canadians could face imprisonment, or worse, yet they proceeded, driven by loyalty to their allies and a conviction that leaving the six to their fate would be unconscionable. For the United States, the politics were equally sharp. The embassy hostages, 52 Americans held in plain view, dominated headlines worldwide. Every day that passed was a humiliation for Washington. If the six hidden diplomats were captured on top of that, the crisis would deepen into catastrophe. It would signal not only impotence but recklessness, as America's inability to protect even those who escaped would become propaganda for the revolution. The CIA understood the stakes. That was why the cover story had to be flawless, why Tony Mendez carried with him not only forged stamps and passports, but the trappings of a full production company. The tradecraft was an extension of politics. By creating a cover that could survive both a guard's suspicion and a government scrutiny, the agency was buying not just six lives, but a narrative of competence at a time when America desperately needed one. Meanwhile, inside Tehran, the politics of control operated at a granular level. Revolutionary guards stationed at Mehrabad International Airport were not seasoned customs officers. Many were students turned militiamen, empowered by ideology rather than training. They thrived on intimidation, dragging foreigners into back rooms, seizing documents, questioning them for hours. Some were zealous, others opportunistic, but all operated in an atmosphere of suspicion. Every checkpoint was a performance of revolutionary vigilance. That atmosphere made the Argo cover story both risky and oddly plausible. The absurdity of a Canadian film crew scouting for a science fiction movie in Tehran was the kind of story that could confuse suspicion rather than confirm it. Revolutionary officials prided themselves on being gatekeepers of a new Islamic order, yet they were also eager for signs that Iran remained connected to the outside world. A film crew suggested cultural legitimacy, foreign currency, and prestige. The very strangeness of the cover might disarm suspicion, provided the details held together. Economically, the mission cost little. Forged documents, rented office space in Los Angeles, a magazine advertisement, airline tickets. Politically, it risked everything. If the Iranians uncovered the operation, it could derail any chance of negotiation over the 52 embassy hostages. It could sever US-Canada relations with Tehran permanently. It could even provoke a hostage crisis of its own if Canadian diplomats were seized in retaliation. For Mendez, the politics were a background hum, constant but not paralyzing. His focus was on the 6 Americans rehearsing their roles, memorizing their cover identities, and learning to inhabit the arrogance of filmmakers. But he knew that if even one detail slipped, The fallout would not end at the airport gates. It would ripple across continents, shaming Washington, endangering Ottawa, and emboldening Tehran. As dawn approached, on January 28, 1980, the weight of those politics was condensed into a single reality: 7 people walking into an airport, 6 Americans and 1 CIA officer, armed with nothing but forged identities and nerve. Behind them, the Canadian embassy prepared to close its doors, ready to vanish from Tehran in the aftermath of the mission. Ahead of them stood Revolutionary Guards with rifles and suspicion in their eyes. The balance of diplomacy and deception was about to be tested. January 28, 1980. The winter sky over Tehran was pale and cold when 2 cars left the Canadian residences, carrying 7 passengers toward Mehrabad International Airport. 6 were American diplomats in borrowed Canadian identities. The 7th was Tony Mendez, the CIA officer who had crafted their escape. They carried no weapons, no backup plan, no way out if the story failed. Their defense was paper, confidence, and the performance of a lie. The drive was silent, punctuated only by the sounds of a city still raw from revolution. Posters of Ayatollah Khomeini stared from the walls. Revolutionary Guards manned intersections, rifles slung across their shoulders, checking cars at random. The fugitives sat stiff in their seats, rehearsing their roles in their minds. A director, a producer, a cinematographer. Their names had changed. Their lives depended on remembering them. When they arrived at Mehrabad, the air inside the terminal was heavy with suspicion. Guards in green fatigues scanned travelers, looking for signs of deceit. Loudspeakers barked announcements in Farsi. Families huddled around luggage. Foreigners stood out, their documents scrutinized more than anyone else's. Mendez led the group to the airline counter. Their tickets were booked for Swissair, a flight to Zurich, with connections onward to North America. The clerk glanced at their passports, stamped with Canadian insignia and visas. He asked routine questions. The 6 answered calmly, rehearsed phrases delivered with practiced ease. Behind them, Revolutionary Guards patrolled the floor, their eyes sharp, their presence suffocating. The first hurdle passed smoothly, but the real test came at customs and immigration. Here, Revolutionary Guards inspected documents, questioned travelers, and sometimes pulled people aside for interrogation. The 6 Americans stepped forward one by one, presenting their passports. A guard stopped them. He flipped through the pages of a passport, frowning. His eyes moved from the photograph to the man before him. He asked in Farsi what their business in Iran had been. Mendez answered smoothly. They were part of a Canadian film crew scouting locations for a science fiction movie called Argo. He handed over production artwork, glossy sheets showing alien landscapes and futuristic costumes. The guard studied them, puzzled. The material was so out of place in that grim terminal that it seemed to defy suspicion. For a moment, time froze. If the guard called for a superior, if he led them into a back room, the operation would collapse. Mendez calm, the Americans rehearsed nonchalance, the Canadian passports, all of it would be tested in a locked interrogation chamber. Instead, the guard chuckled, muttered something about crazy foreigners, and waved them through. The group advanced, hearts pounding, but the ordeal was not yet over. At the departure gate, another guard lingered over the passports, flipping through them slowly. He asked questions again, this time in broken English. Movie, Canada, science fiction. His tone carried suspicion, but also curiosity. The Americans answered with casual arrogance, as if annoyed at being delayed. One even described the plot of Argo, inventing details on the spot, a story of heroes on a distant planet fighting for survival. The guard smirked, shaking his head, and finally stamped the last passport. At that moment, the six realized they had crossed the final barrier. They walked down the jetway, boarding the Swiss airplane, their legs weak with adrenaline. Mendez waited until every one of them was seated before allowing himself to exhale. The engines roared. The plane taxied down the runway. As it lifted into the cold Tehran sky, leaving the city behind, the weight of weeks of fear began to dissolve. Only once the plane was out of Iranian airspace did the truth settle. The mission had succeeded. Against every expectation, 6 Americans had walked through the heart of revolutionary Tehran with forged identities and a fake movie as their shield. The CIA had gambled on audacity, and the audacity had worked. When the Swissair flight touched down in Zurich, the tension that had gripped 7 passengers for days finally broke. The 6 Americans, still clutching their Canadian passports, were safe. They had escaped the gauntlet of Tehran, free at last, after weeks of hiding. In Washington, word of their survival spread quickly through the State Department and the CIA. In Ottawa, Prime Minister Joe Clark quietly confirmed Canada's role, announcing that Canadian diplomats had sheltered and rescued the Americans. Both governments celebrated the success, but with caution. For now, secrecy remained paramount. In Tehran, the Iranians discovered only later that 6 Americans had slipped through their grasp. By then, the Canadians had shuttered their embassy, their diplomats already out of the country. Furious Revolutionary Guards stormed the abandoned residences, finding little more than empty rooms and burned papers. The regime denounced Canada, accusing it of collusion, but the mission was already complete. The Americans were home, and Iran had been outplayed. In the United States, the operation was initially framed as the Canadian Caper, with Canada taking most of the public credit. This was by design. The CIA's role remained classified, known only to a small circle. Tony Mendez, the man who had orchestrated the escape, returned to Langley quietly, his success marked not by public acclaim, but by the satisfaction of 6 lives saved. Inside the agency, his colleagues recognized the operation for what it was, one of the most daring exfiltrations in modern intelligence history. Only years later, when the mission was declassified in the late 1990s, did the full story come to light. The CIA released details of Mendez's role, acknowledging the artistry and audacity of the cover. Mendez himself recounted the mission in his memoirs, describing how an artist's eye had become a weapon of intelligence. His story revealed that espionage was not always about guns and dead drops. Sometimes it was about imagination, creativity, and the courage to bet on a lie. The 6 Americans never forgot the Canadians who had sheltered them, nor the CIA officer who had led them out. For Ambassador Ken Taylor and his staff, the mission became a source of pride, a moment when Canada had stood firm in the face of danger. For Tony Mendez, it was one of many operations in a career that spanned decades, but it was the one that entered history. The legacy extended beyond intelligence circles. In 2012, Hollywood turned the mission into a film, Argo, directed by and starring Ben Affleck. The film dramatized the events, blending truth with cinematic license. It won the Academy Award for Best Picture, introducing millions to the story of the Canadian Caper. For some, it was their first glimpse of Tony Mendez and the CIA's quiet work. For others, it was a reminder of how history can be stranger than fiction. Yet for the men and women who lived it, the truth was even sharper than Hollywood's version. The fear of being discovered in safe houses, the dread of the airport checkpoints, the weight of false names and borrowed identities, the tension that no camera could fully capture. Their survival was not scripted. It was fought for in whispers, rehearsals, and the nerve to walk calmly through a city that wanted them dead. In Langley, Mendez received the Intelligence Star, one of the agency's highest honors. His name was added to the quiet roll of officers recognized for valor. Years later, as the story spread, he reflected that his greatest satisfaction was not the awards or the film, but the fact that 6 Americans had returned home to their families. The Argo exfiltration remains a defining case study in intelligence. It shows that deception, when crafted with precision and daring, can achieve what force cannot. It shows the power of alliances, how Canada and the United States worked in unison, risking reputations and lives for a common cause. And it shows the humanity of intelligence work, the ability to imagine, to adapt, to take risks that defy reason, all in the service of bringing people home. Today, the mission is remembered as one of the most audacious in CIA history. A fake movie, a forged identity, a team of fugitives turned actors, and one artist who walked them out of Tehran with nothing more than paper, confidence, and nerve. Tony Mendez's story stands as proof that sometimes the boldest operations are not those waged with guns, but those staged with imagination.